So welcome to the session, IT Governance is Broken, 9 Ways Enterprises Mismanage Their Cyber Risk. This is a paper that we recently put out. So myself and actually my co-author, Courtney Brammer, she is with Cybersecurity Case Studies, and she is a great resource. She has a catalog, a library of cybersecurity case studies with very granular loss details. So if you're looking for that type of information, I highly recommend her website and her resources there. But we put out a joint paper about a month ago, actually in COVID time, maybe it was 2 months ago now, I'm not sure. And would love to be doing this in person, but obviously we're relegated to the virtual world here. So as Jason said, going to go through the 9 discussion points. We'll talk about what we see as problems. We'll talk a little bit about resolutions. And a lot of this data came from talking to CISOs. We are very fortunate at Recorded Future. We have hundreds of clients sort of globally dispersed, and we're able to talk to not just the CISOs, but also some of the operational folks, as well as folks within the GRC function. So that's really where this paper and the presentation originates from. So before we jump into it here, just 2 slides, I really want to recognize what a challenge good cyber risk management is. And it really kind of feels like a moonshot. And I think—
Let me stop you there. Sorry, your screen is not sharing right now, Levi, just in case you have your screen share. If you want to just share your screen.
Well, that would be helpful, wouldn't it, Jason?
It would, before you get in full flow. There you go. Now it's sharing.
Thank you. I always forget something. The virtual world. Thank you. So the moonshot. This is a moonshot, and I think you think about these things. It's sort of Elon Musk, trying to put a rocket into to orbit and then bring it down back vertically on a platform in the ocean is sort of the degree of difficulty that cyber risk management feels like today, in the context of just ever increasing technical complexity within the enterprise, and then adversaries that have what seems or feels like sometimes near limitless resources and focus. So in order to have a fighting chance, enterprises especially have to have good cyber, digital, IT, whatever you want to call it, governance. And this is really all about how to think about some of the issues in governance and how we get there. So first off, what is governance? This is a definition that I think I stole from Harvard Business Review circa 2004. I'm not sure where the quote actually originates. I had trouble sort of finding the original attribution for it. But I think the best part about this definition is really the last part, which is encouraging desirable behavior in the use of information technology. And I think when we think about governance, we talk about governance, there's a lot of thought about sort of how it just relates to sort of the corollary in government, how which people have the decision rights, which people have authority, which people have responsibility to do certain things in the organization. And that's obviously an important part of governance as a label or a term. But it's really the second part that we want to focus on, that Courtney and I wanted to focus on in terms of this study, is how do we encourage desirable behavior, and how do we get to that point in enterprise governance? So the first point here is it's really about how do organizations, how do they figure out what they need to spend when it comes to security controls? And this is a very difficult question to answer. And as you all know, oftentimes the board of directors, their first question is are we spending enough on security? Which is sort of the wrong question to start with, but that's often the question that you hear a lot. And it's really an ever-present burden on CISOs to figure out not just how much should the enterprise expect to spend on security, but then also convince their governance functions to approve that spend. And we put a bunch of examples in the paper. These are just a couple examples on this slide, and I'll show you a couple examples in the next slide, where you can look historically at a lot of different data points around loss to kind of figure out whether the spend makes sense in terms of the corresponding loss or not. And there's all kinds of data points for this. So when you look at the current corporate governance approach, a lot of how decisions are made are just too conservative. The frame of reference is just too conservative. And that's fiscally, that's technologically. And a lot of it is, does investment beyond compliance, is that something that we really want to do? And that's still a leap of faith for a lot of folks. So there's sort of this budget keeping mindset, but it's not always about financial loss. For example, 2017, NotPetya, one of the companies that got impacted by that was Merck. And for historical context, Merck is actually still in a court battle with their insurance provider in the state of Illinois, because I believe it was Zurich does not want to pay out on the claim because there was this exception in the claim that they were not going to cover acts of war, right? And that's what they're saying NotPetya was, because Russia, the GRU, was behind it. And Merck has said that they've lost, over $1 billion because of that cyber event. It actually impacted their ability to manufacture drugs, specifically for the HPV vaccine and drugs and so forth. So not all of the losses are always going to be confined to, just numbers on the paper. When you think about critical infrastructure, you think about the pharmaceutical industry, and this can extend, much, much further. So this is the second sort of chart I was talking about. Some of the examples here: 2019, Capital One had a data breach that basically cost them $500 million, or roughly $5 per victim customer. There's a lot of other examples in here, and what we do is in the paper we sort of break this down in left of boom, right of boom, which is how did the attackers initially access these organizations, right, in an unauthorized manner, and then once they were inside of the network, what did they do subsequent to that? And then we sort of talk about the loss details, right, when they occurred and what the amounts were. So it's really important, to tie these back from a governance perspective, again, to ensure that the correct frame of reference is really being used when really evaluating these types of losses against current investment in security spend. So that's sort of the first part of this. Then the second point is that, a lot of this actually came from experience. So in a prior life, I ran threat intelligence for an enterprise organization, and I was exposed to this fact that so much of what happens is driven by consensus. So even if you have consensus, then you still have to wait for a committee to meet, right? And that committee meeting may only happen once a quarter. So you may determine that, hey, we have a gap in our controls, we have a real issue that has to be solved for, but we can't actually go get the money and the spend that we need, right, until this committee meeting happens. And as you all know, that's not the way that adversaries work in the cyber domain. Right? They work very quickly, they evolve very quickly. If you look at, just as an example, you look at the Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities and how quickly adversaries picked up that vulnerability and started weaponizing it, both in a targeted way, but also opportunistically. And that's just around a vulnerability program. But you can imagine, the complexity of security controls in the organization is so broad that when you identify something that needs to be remediated, you have to act, very quickly. So, I sort of talk about this in the terms of cognitive dissonance, right? Which is, if a breach hasn't happened to us yet, then we don't really need to spend any more on controls. But as I said, Microsoft Exchange, SolarWinds, so forth would suggest otherwise. So again, going back to sort of NotPetya with Maersk, right, in 2017, it's interesting because 3 months prior, the National Health Service was hit by WannaCry. And the question is, for the survey is, did Maersk have enough time to sort of look at what was happening in the National Health Service and being impacted by WannaCry? Can, look at that event and say, well, that is a major disruptive event to their organization, the business. Should we be investing more now, right? And they basically had 2.5 months, 3 months before NotPetya hit them. What is that enough time, right? To the point about moving slowly. The NHS subsequently invested $150 million in new controls. So you sort of have to ask the question, why didn't Maersk learn from that event? And you sort of extrapolate that out and say, this stuff happens all the time, but why aren't organizations sort of learning from these corollary events that are happening maybe in their industry, maybe in other industries? So it looks like 38% of you say yes, which is interesting, and then 30% of you said maybe. So that's really encouraging. 15% of you said no, 18% of you say wouldn't have mattered. And I think that's the point, is the yes and maybes is really where we need to get to as an industry when it comes to governance, to say when another organization has a sort of cataclysmic event, a cyber event that is, costing them significant amounts of money and maybe more, that there has to be a point of introspection and self-reflection to say, now is the time that we do something about that, not waiting, right? And there's obviously 4 ways that cyber risk gets escalated into these committees. So you have sort of those risks that are self-identified by the business unit via some sort of internal risk assessment. You have those that are identified proactively or maybe even reactively by the CISOs group, the information security team, based on some sort of external event like a WannaCry. You have those that are escalated via an audit action point, and sometimes that's after an issue's materialized, prompting the review. And then last, it may be highlighted by a regulatory's finding, and those are obviously reactive. So it's really, being able to identify things proactively and move quickly, right? Which is not the way that enterprises are traditionally set up today in terms of how governance works, to be able to respond to these. So on that same point, there's a lot of things that enterprises do specifically for audit compliance. And it's obviously important to cover compliance and to be really tight on audit, because if you fail your Sarbanes-Oxley, if you fail your SOC 2, there are significant repercussions, obviously, that come out of that. And my ugly Venn diagram here, what I'm trying to communicate is that there are certainly security improvements that happen when you're able to check the boxes on audit. And when you're passing your audits, there's obviously good things that happen in terms of operational risk reduction, but it doesn't necessarily cover all of your operational risk in the way that you may want to reduce it. So ideal digital governance here means that management and budget committees are going to have visibility not just into the audit compliance side of things, but also the risk management side of things, to properly allocate cybersecurity resources and really make the best decisions about where risk is tolerable and where risk needs to be mitigated. And a lot of times, the way that enterprises look at this is, as long as we are passing our audits and as long as we're compliant and we have a good cyber insurance policy in place, then why are we going to spend more money and additional resources beyond that sort of litmus test? Right. And that's an interesting question. But again, I think if you go back to the fact that cyber insurance policies are not paying out oftentimes the way that companies expect them to, because of these clauses and carve-outs, number one. And then number two, again, the losses can be more significant, right, than what organizations are anticipating or expecting. And I'm not saying that audit doesn't have any value. There's a couple examples in our paper where we specifically call out the fact that audit really did lend quite a bit of value to an organization. So in 2018, Erie County Medical Center was hit with a ransomware attack. And the medical center had taken the auditor's suggestion to increase their coverage on the insurance 5-fold prior to the attack. And it did pay out, and that did help them. We talk about another one where an audit group actually uncovered unauthorized access. So there are good things that come out of the audit function, but there has to be a fundamental realization that they're not one and the same thing. Cyber threats evolve daily. They're constantly evolving. And if you look at the audit side of things, an audit says, well, to be compliant, we need to do a quarterly penetration test. Okay? But if you actually want to reduce operational risk to a different sort of level, you have to say, well, we actually need to be doing control validation. Right? We actually need to be able to identify adversary tools and tactics and the way they evolve, and we need to be able to compare them to our security controls, whether endpoint, network, technical, policy, whatever it may be at any given point in time. And that's sort of a different frame of reference than just we need to go pass our audit. So what does that look like in terms of a sort of purple teaming scenario? This is where threat intelligence really does play a vital role in control validation. And I just grabbed a quick snapshot out of a homepage from Recorded Future. These are the sorts of updates, right? New implant frameworks, new evolutions on existing frameworks, right, that are going to be used in some way to target Windows machines inside of an enterprise. Being able to surface these things and then being able to do assessments on these things in a quicker time period is going to reduce operational risk in a way that's very different from, again, just saying, well, we need to do a quarterly pen test and we're going to pass our audit and we can sort of move on from there. Okay, point number 3. So one of the things that we notice is that there seems to be a lot of variability in terms of who a CISO reports to. And oftentimes when the CISO is reporting to a CIO, there's a misaligned incentive between the technology enablement mission and the reducing operational risk mission. And they tend to be two very different things. So for the survey here, if you're a CISO, who do you report to? And if you're not, who does your CISO report to? We really think that it's important for CISOs to have more visibility in the organization and to really have a seat at that executive table. So we really think it's important for CISOs to be peers of the CIO. And that's, again, to really align efforts effectively. GRC and operational security teams tend to be in different reporting structures. But the CISO, can report to a chief risk officer, or chief operating officer, even a chief financial officer, or chief legal officer. And that's something that I think when you get the organizational structure correct, again, back to just overarching umbrella governance, can really make a difference, right, in how your organization thinks about reducing risk. One of the former SOC managers that I spoke with told me that his team's job was essentially to remediate security incidents as quickly as possible to avoid that information ever escalating to the CIO, right? The CIO didn't really want to see it, didn't really want to hear about it, right? Because he was just very focused on the technology enablement mission, which is great, obviously very important, but the CISO needs to have an equal voice, right, at the executive table. So on the survey results, it looks like 50% of you said that your CISO reports to a CIO, and it looks like there's a couple, 2 of you said chief legal officer, 4 of you said chief risk officer, and then 3 of you said chief technical officer. Oh, and then 8 of you said chief operating officer, COO, and then 10% of you said other. So that's super interesting. So it looks like there's roughly a 50-50 breakdown between CIO and then other types of functions or titles in the organization. So I think we're going to start to see some of that changing over time, where there is going to be a recognition, right? And I think the 50% of you that said no, that he doesn't report to a CIO, I think from a governance perspective, you're really on the right track there. Okay, so number 4, as we're talking about organizational charts, and the topic here is just because you have an organizational chart that seems to align under sort of a technology mission or mandate does not mean you have good governance. On this point, what we found in surveying the folks that we talked to is that while there's misalignment sometimes between a CISO and a CIO, there's also sometimes misalignment between the GRC group, right, the governance, risk, and compliance group, and then those that are actually putting hands on keyboard in an operational security function. So maybe the SOC, maybe incident response team or vulnerability management team, security architecture, whatever it may be, that a lot of times there's just misalignment. And the perception tends to be that GRC professionals are only concerned with passing audits, again, SOC, SOC 2, whatever it may be. And the operational security teams are very aloof. They don't have any patience when it comes to explaining technical security concepts or strategies. And that division in reporting structures tends to exacerbate the problems. So one of our recommendations is that executives think about aligning incentives and motivations between GRC and operational security teams to really help increase mutual respect for each other, right? And the overarching objective, which really is IT risk management. And we think that it's a relatively easy thing to do from a governance perspective in terms of structure that would have significant benefits. Now, obviously, if you take operational security out of the CIO's group and sort of technology group, you still need the technology group to support the security practitioners, right? So if they need access to a SIM, they need access to a database, they need access to certain tools, it's really important that the IT group is still a partner and still helping to facilitate the security mission. But if you're able to organizationally align GRC with operational security, then everyone is sort of working right within the same silo, not just to pass internal and external audits, but really working together to achieve risk reduction. That's sort of the core of this whole point here in number 4. Did we miss? Oh, sorry, I missed the survey here. So the survey is, does your GRC team and your operational security teams, do they work well together? Let's see the numbers. Numbers are moving.
Wow, yeah, very, very quickly.
Interesting. So we had.
There you go. I'll end that now and share the results. Sorry, there you go, Levi.
Yeah, so 56% said frequently, which is great. And then 38% said rarely, 5% said never. That's actually a better survey result than we've seen in the past. I think in the past, it actually skewed the other way, where we had roughly over 50% say rarely or never, and a smaller group said frequently. So that's great. I think this group here has a better existing relationship in terms of the internal dynamics and politics, which is fantastic. But the point is that anything the organization can do to better align those two missions and mandates is going to be super helpful, right, to help achieve what the enterprise needs to do over the long term. All right, so we talked about this a little bit before, but point number 5 is that compliance does not mean operational risk reduction, right? We talked about this earlier. A lot of what we see happens inside the enterprise is there's a prioritization of different frameworks, and there's a desire to increase model maturity, whether it's ISO 27001, NIST cybersecurity framework, whatever it is. When that sort of becomes the overarching objective of the security program, it can lead to a check the box mentality, right? And the check the box mentality is, well, the framework says we need to build a fence, so we're going to go build a fence, but we're going to build it out of bacon, right? Or the framework says that we need firewalls, so we implement firewalls, but we don't properly create and tune the rules. Or it says we need a SOC, and we go hire people that are not capable of really, running a SOC, right? So we can check the box, but we haven't necessarily fulfilled the requirement, right? And we haven't necessarily reduced operational risk. The other problem on this is that these frameworks, they may update every 18 months to 24 months, but it's nowhere near quick enough to parallel what's happening in the adversary space. So as you all know, the past decade is really littered with companies that suffered a breach after passing an audit and being certified compliant in one of these frameworks. So the frameworks are very helpful in terms of tools in the tool belt. There's no doubt about that. But compliance does not mean that you're actually reducing risk in a way that the company and the organization is comfortable with. So our recommendation is that executives and the board of directors, they really need, again, 2 real-time views. So one is, how are we doing on audit compliance? That's one. And the second one is, how are we doing with risk management? Again, they're 2 different things. There may be some overlap, but not necessarily. So it's really important, regardless of sort of the frameworks that you're using and how you're tracking maturity, that you don't use that, right, to say that this is the same as our operational risk, right, in the way that we communicate these 2 things. So point number 6 is CEOs, right, have to become more engaged in IT governance. Gartner expects that by 2024, 75% of CEOs will be personally liable for cybersecurity incidents. And in the paper, we have a bunch of different examples of CEOs that were fired or terminated from their jobs following, a breach. And there may be more personal liability, not just for CISOs, but also for CEOs. So we think, more CEO engagement in IT governance is going to become so important and critical to an organization's success around cyber risk. One example here is in 2018, Hancock Health CEO, they published sort of their own account of an attack as it was happening after threat actors obtained the login credentials to a vendor that was providing hardware for one of the hospital's information systems. And that's the sort of level of engagement that tends to have positive effects versus CEOs that just remain very removed and detached. So the survey here is your CEO regularly engaged in cyber risk management? And if so, how often?
Once again, folks, we'll leave this up for about 30 seconds, allow as many people to participate as possible. Keep them coming. Thank you very much. Excellent stuff. Okay, we'll give us another 5 seconds. We are literally getting every single person in the session voting right now.
Excellent.
Good stuff. All right, let's end there and share the results.
Interesting. So it's a pretty good spread here. So 42% quarterly, 27% said monthly, which is very good. Both of those are great. 5% said weekly, and then 25% said rarely. 2% said not at all. So a bit of a split in terms of the spectrum there. But I think, again, just as we sort of talked about the CISO, I think the CEO, you're going to see over time, right? CEOs are going to be spending more time and really paying more attention to what's happening in IT risk management, right, within the organization, and that is super healthy for the organization and for governance, right, and in the long term. All right. So point number 7 is that we believe very strongly that cyber risks need to be quantified. And sometimes this can be, I think, a little bit provocative. And the reason for that is there really is no stated sort of industry accepted way to quantify risk. There's a lot of frameworks out there like FAIR, F-A-I-R, that have different perspectives and slants on how to do this. And I put this image in the deck because sometimes when we think about sort of quantifying risk, we conjure up these images of very complex sort of formulas and whatnot. And I don't think it needs to be that way at all. So I actually put out a book last year, and I put forth a framework called Threat Category Risk, which is sort of similar to FAIR, but it's really designed to be very practical. It's something that you can do in a couple of days. It doesn't take a couple months or a couple of years. Right? It's really designed to be very practical for you. So the problem is that enterprise executives often make bad decisions about security control spend based on bad data. So I've been in this situation myself where a lot of the ways that we qualify risk in the enterprise today tends to be traffic light, right? It's a red, it's a yellow, it's a green, it's a high, a medium, low. Well, what does that mean at the end of the day, right? For executives that are looking at these charts, these heat map charts or reports, what does it mean that a risk is medium or that it's amber, right? Do they lose more sleep? Do they lose less sleep? Because at the end of the day, really what executives care about is, are we going to lose money? And if so, how much, right? That's the majority of it, right? This year, are we going to lose money and how much? Whether you're talking about shareholders, stock price, whether you're talking about reputation, whether you're talking about operational outages, it all boils down into numbers. And so being able to translate what is happening in operational security into the language of risk, into the language of the business becomes so important. So there's nothing wrong with the traditional formula, likelihood of occurrence times impact. The problem is that there historically has not been a lot of rigor put into that formula. So frankly, you put garbage into it, you're going to get garbage out of it. And the people that need to make decisions are making decisions on bad data. So as you all know, not every threat actually presents a risk to the enterprise, right? You have many controls that are already in place that mean many of these threats are not going to be risks. So it's really important that even if you don't want to use, an existing framework, that you really you figure out a framework that works for you and the organization in being able to quantify the impact and the associated loss when it comes to different cyber risks. And the risk matrix can help visualize this stuff, and that's fine. But you have to be able to have very candid conversations about the type of formula you're using, the assumptions in the formula, the variables in the formula, and how you ended up at some of these numbers. A lot of times the attempt to quantify risk is met with skepticism. And that's fine, right? If it starts a conversation and you can have a conversation, that's really, the biggest issue we've seen across enterprises, that even if you have folks that are motivated to really try and represent and quantify risk in a certain way, there are other teams that may not want to communicate about risk that way, may not want to calculate that way. So really coming to consensus about this is the way we're going to calculate cyber risk, and this is the way we're going to talk about and communicate it becomes really, really important to the business. And obviously GRC and other groups, they have their formulas for calculating geopolitical risk and business risk and all kinds of different types of risk. But cyber is, a bit unique in the way that you do quantify and the approach that you take there. So what we've seen is that, there's kind of some different approaches out there. Like, once a security event materializes, I'll get the budget I need, or sort of a reactionary approach, which is, there are risks out there, right? But I can't really communicate, I can't really quantify, so we're just going to have to wait for that risk to materialize before I can sort of get my budget. Then the second approach, which is not great either, is, well, if I self-identify with this risk assessment, they might expect me to solve this issue without additional budget. But if I wait for audit to find it, then I'll get the extra budget. And if audit misses it, well, how could I have known about it, right? And that approach just kind of pushes the problem down the road. So we think that this is a really important point, and it's actually something I'm very personally passionate about, is if you're able to get those right, and if you're able to get, I hate the word stakeholders, but I don't know how else to say it, if you get multiple people, right, across different teams and groups across the organization to buy into this, it can be very powerful for how you communicate risks around cyber and how you can quickly move to remediate, right, if the risk threshold is not something that the company is comfortable with, which is sort of, its own question. So the survey question here is, are you quantifying cyber risk today? Or are you trying to quantify cyber risk today?
Is the last poll of this particular session, folks. So please vote if you can. We'll leave it up for another 10 seconds or so. Give it 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. A couple last minute votes in there. There you go. Fantastic.
Excellent. So our winner at 43% is yes, but poorly. And this is interesting because, I've talked to a lot of CISOs who said they wanted to implement FAIR, or they've been trying to implement FAIR, but they have very little to show for it. And some of them have been at it for multiple years. And I think, part of the issue here is getting bogged down in some of the details that aren't necessary. And again, I think that you can do a great job of quantifying risk just using things like estimates, using things like Monte Carlo simulations, right? And there are no perfect models. There are no perfect models anywhere, right? But if you can come up with a practical, useful model, it can be super helpful. So 25% of you said yes, and then everyone else said no, or either don't have the resources or you're in the planning stages of it. So I think the point here is you want to look to quantify risk in a very practical sort of way, and something that's relatively quick and relatively achievable. And I haven't heard that about FAIR from the CISOs that I've talked to. I have very few, I don't think I have any data points or examples of people that have been able to do it in a short amount of time. All right, point number 8 here is that if you're going to make security what we call in the paper sort of a collective approach here, a collective ownership approach to governance, there's really 4 roles to this, right? So number 1 is preventative. which is if you don't click on a suspected phishing link in an email, that's a preventative sort of collective ownership, right? That's something that everyone in the organization can do. Number two is detective. So if you identify someone accessing files that they shouldn't have access to, or they don't have a business need for them, and you escalate that observation, right? That's a detective sort of ownership control. Corrective would be resetting passwords after some sort of cyber event. And then directive would be rewarding individuals who practice good security hygiene. So preventative, detective, corrective, and directive. And there's good things that come out of sort of the collective approach to this governance. But when every employee is on the front lines, it means that they become an asset, and their infrastructure becomes an asset. Computers, phones, working at home, and so forth. So it really becomes important that training and education happens in a way that is much more than just we all need to watch a 3-hour video so we can check the box on compliance, right? And it has to be more than that. It has to be informing and empowering your employees to really act beyond just the scope of that compliance training. And I think from personal experience, one of the things that resonates so much for employees is if you can provide value for them in their personal life, if you can tell a story about things they should be doing in their personal life, maybe it's around email and social media, and maybe it's around Wi-Fi, whatever it is, sort of bringing them into those conversations and really giving them the best tools is going to help translate into the business and the enterprise as well. And if you can go the other way and say, well, we're not going to go with sort of a collective approach, but if you do that, then the opposite is sort of overt or even covert surveillance of employee activities, right? And that really diminishes trust across the company, and it can be counterproductive to trying to collectively motivate your employees to help you, detect and subvert cyber attacks. So this is one that is sort of tricky, I think, to do, but a great goal to strive for in trying to move beyond just sort of that compliance training. So that brings us to number 9, and this is the last point. And this goes back to the point we said earlier, which is that executives and the board, they really need sort of two views, right? They need the view of how things are progressing on audit compliance, but they also need that view around operational security risk. And in order to do this, you're going to have to move beyond Excel spreadsheets and a couple of interns, right? To put it bluntly, right? And a proof of concept risk register, because it's not going to work. So we talked to a longtime GRC veteran who'd been in the space for quite a while, and she was telling us that they outsourced an exercise where they brought in a consultant, right, to do the cataloging of controls. And this outsourced third-party company came in and said, okay, well, you have 900 controls to implement. And that's a ridiculous number, of course, but that's what all enterprises are facing, right, because of the technical complexity inside the organization. So then they said, okay, well, we can get those 900 controls down to 256 that are sort of, your core tier 1 you must do to satisfy the audit regulatory requirements. Still a crazy number, right, at 256. So the point is that you're going to have to implement technology, right? Again, IT being an enabler of the security and risk mission. You have to have technology that's going to enable this type of governance, right? And if that means if that means real-time dashboards, right? That's going to be a much better way to go than sort of point-in-time PowerPoint presentations that get updated quarterly, right? And if executives have the visibility they need into both of these components, then they can better address risk, right, in a more timely fashion. So to constantly and continuously be validating all these controls and then translating that into quantitative risk figures is going to require, some pretty substantial technology applications. One of the folks we talked to, right, they had recently been hit with a denial of service attack, and the executives after the attack are asking questions like, how much does this kind of attack cost the company? How much does a new control cost to try and mitigate these types of denial of service attacks in the future? What's the probability that this type of attack is going to happen again this year? How often this year? Do we need a business process change? if you don't have automation in place, it takes a long time to answer those types of questions. So being able to apply technology and present real-time views for both of these is going to lead to much stronger governance. So really appreciate your time and attention and all the interaction. Thank you so much for filling out the surveys. Really appreciate it. If you want to shoot me an email, I'm just levi@recordedfuture.com. You can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn. And I can also point you to Courtney Brammer's website. If you have any questions about that, you can just shoot me an email. But with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Jason.
Thank you very much, sir. We promised the people some Q&A, and as much as the session is supposed to end now, I'm going to let it run for another 5 so we can get through as much of this Q&A as possible. So folks, I've put Levi's email here. Just going to quickly stop sharing the screen now, just so you can reach out to him accordingly. First one that comes in nice and easy. Can you drop the name of the book that you mentioned around Simplify's version of FAIR quickly?
Oh, yeah. Let me, 1 sec. I'll just grab I have a copy somewhere around here.
Oh, it's going to disappear into the abyss. There we go. It's going to come back.
Yeah, so you can grab the book. I don't know if you can see it. There we go.
The risk.
You can grab the book on Amazon, or you can grab a soft copy off of the Recorded Future website. It's a PDF. So depending on whether you want a soft copy or a hard copy, but that's the book. And it's actually based on the book by Hubbard and Searson called How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk, which is really a seminal read in our industry.
Fantastic. Question here, doesn't changing or encouraging desirable behavior require a change in culture?
It does, absolutely. And I think, that's the point, right? It's sort of the umbrella point about governance is that, you need to change culture, and it starts with the CEO, right? And the CIO, the CISO. And, it has to probably be both, right? Top down, but also bottom up. And it's not like 1 or 2 people can sort of change, institutional culture. There has to be a concerted effort across, all sort of tiers of the organization. But yeah, absolutely.
What's your take on outdated governance models propagating security control spending inertia?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
What is your take on outdated governance models that propagate security control spending?
I mean, at a high level, I think they're terrible. And I've worked in enterprises where, I had to leave the enterprise to go to a startup. I joined Recorded Future in 2015. I think we had 50 employees at the time, because I literally just couldn't handle the enterprise anymore because those outdated governance models are driving me crazy. And when, obviously when you're having to respond to the speed of an adversary and you're dealing with these outdated governance models, especially around, control spending and that inertia, it makes you want to pull your hair out. And I couldn't personally handle it anymore, so I had to leave. But, that's the whole point behind the paper, is that hopefully, when we ask some somewhat intelligent questions, it gets people thinking about, look, we've been doing the same things, right, for the last decade, and it's sort of the definition of insanity, right? We're doing the same things across enterprises, and the outcome continues to be the same, which is massive amounts of losses, massive amount of disruption, massive amounts of downtime, and none of that's really changing. So it's time to start reevaluating what we're doing in governance, and all the things that flow underneath this governance umbrella. Because if we're just going to continue to do the same things, then we can expect the same outcomes and nothing's going to change.
Very well said. Question here, would love to hear your thoughts on the recent attack on the electricity grid in India, if you know too much about it, obviously to the extent that you can talk about it.
Yeah, so we put out the report on this, and we talked about attribution as well, but it was activity that our research team had been really following for roughly 6 months. And it was one of those, it's difficult to say attack, right? But when we observed the traffic, right, between implants within the Indian energy grid, and it was really interesting because it was really comprehensive, right? And we looked at it geographically, and it was the majority of the grid and substations in India that were communicating, right, with this known malicious server. And, you know, whether it was just pre-positioning by the Chinese, right, whether it was designed to send them some sort of signal based on just the geopolitical tensions that had been occurring, right, on the border in the Himalayas, right? It's hard to know why, and we can only speculate. But from our perspective, right, the activity itself was very unsettling because, again, you're in the energy grid and you're messing with capabilities, right, that can really have an impact, again, beyond just financial losses, to actually impacting people's lives. And, you know, it doesn't appear that they did anything with that unauthorized access inside the grid, but only India knows, right? We don't know, only India knows, and the companies that run those power stations. But it was, from our perspective, it was pretty unsettling.
Definitely. Phil Long asked, does a nation state attack or an act of war still void cyber insurance payout?
Yeah, this is a fascinating topic because right now, courts in Illinois are trying to determine what the definition of act of war is in the cyber context. And again, you know, Merck is suing them for over $1 billion here. So, you know, the outcome of this is going to be closely watched. It's very tricky. Courts are having a really hard time, you know, figuring out what constitutes an act of war. And even though you have the US government coming out and saying, look, NotPetya was the Russians, right? It was the GRU, it was the Russian military behind NotPetya. Is that enough, right? And you think about sort of the preponderance of the evidence or you know, whatever legal standards going to be applied here, it is very tricky, you know, to determine whether that is actually an act of war or not. So I think courts are having a really hard time, and the biggest problem is that how do you do attribution, right? As a company that's suing Zurich in this case, how does Merck do attribution beyond the intelligence community that's come out and said yes, it was Russia? Well, how does Merck actually prove attribution that it was in fact the Russian group? So I think, you know, this is going to continue to evolve, and it's going to be fascinating to watch. But at the end of the day, companies need to think beyond just cyber insurance policies, because I can guarantee you that cyber insurance companies, you know, Zurich is in a lawsuit, Allianz is in a lawsuit, right? They are going to tighten up the language in these policies, and it's going to be harder and harder, I think, to file claims they're going to pay out on, because they really are going to tighten up their language here.
Fantastic. Well, great way to end a session. I'd like to ask everybody to join me in a virtual round of applause for Levi. That was very, very, very insightful.